Aye.
Doesn't know what to continue
Okay, there he is.
All stand. Coronial Court now stands proceedings. Please be seated. You're next.
It is. Superintendent Knowles. My name's Miranda and I am for Constable Brock.
Good afternoon.
I want to start my questioning by just focusing on something you said earlier in relation to the chain of command. I think we want something along the lines of this. The IRT members that were deployed in the 9/9 event reported up to Sergeant Frost. She reported up to you, and you in turn reported up to Assistant Commissioner West.
Correct, there's a couple of links in the command chain there missing, but by and large, in a practical application, that's what it was on that particular day.
In the overall macro sense, that was the chain of command, if I can call it that, for the purpose of this deployment.
Correct, yes.
Now, just to work, say, from the top down, Assistant Commissioner Works effectively gave you the approval under the SOPs to deploy the IRT, General Duties Police Officers, to your unit.
In the absence of the commander, where that delegation sat.
Correct. And that was for the purpose of the General Duties deployment.
Correct, yes.
Now, you were then responsible for considering or curating and ultimately approving the plan as to the deployment of these officers on 9/11.
In a macro sense, yes.
Right. And I'll come back to the macro in a moment. But by and large, you did that in conjunction, if you will, with Julie Frost in terms of how that plan would be effective.
Correct.
Now, it was Julie Frost's responsibility then, I take it, as the remote sergeant, or I'm going to refer to as the forward commander, you're aware of that terminology?
Yes.
She, as the forward commander, was responsible, if you will, for the briefing and deployment of those officers on the ground on 9 November 2019, consistently with the plan in the macro sense that you had devised with her in the lead up to these men's deployment.
Correct, yes.
Now, in relation to that, we've had some evidence recently from a commander, Meacham King, who was a member of the TRG.
Sergeant Meacham King,
Sergeant.
correct, yes.
Now, he agreed with that general proposition, but he also explained that Sergeant Frost would have had some discretion, obviously, but ideally, yes, whatever they agreed upon, she would have to follow out as a direct instruction. I just want to deal with the notion of discretion. Do you agree that Sergeant Frost would have had some discretion in terms of how this plan was to be effective?
Within a narrow remit, yes.
All right, so let's just focus on that a bit more. We know, for example, that nobody knew where Kumanjayi Walker was at the time these men were deployed to Inquest unit. Bearing that in mind, you would agree with me that the 5:30am and 5am arrest plan was to have any reality of being effectively carried out. It would have been important to ascertain the whereabouts of Kumanjayi Walker so as to enhance the ability of the IRT to complete, if you will, the overall mission objective.
Yeah, I gave fairly lengthy evidence in chief in respect to this matter. As a broad proposition, I acknowledged the necessity to have an appreciation as to where someone may be, but the evidence I provided then, and which I'll reassert now, is that we had more than a reasonable intelligence picture as to the high probability locations the following morning.
In that context, when we've had some evidence from other witnesses in Australia, including Julie Frost, and it seems to be the case across the board that no one knew the exact location of Kumanjayi Walker. So bearing that in mind, do you think that it was within Julie Frost's remit or in the exercise of her discretion to task these men with effectively going out and intelligence gathering as to his whereabouts?
No. In my assessment, that's a substantive departure from the macro, broader-based commander's intent.
In that context then, I take it that similar considerations arise in relation to the deployment of these men at 7pm as opposed to 11pm.
Correct, yes.
Right. Those things certainly weren't contemplated by you as being appropriate at the time that you effectively gave authorisation for these men's deployment.
Nor necessary.
And that's also in the context, isn't it, where when you're ultimately giving consideration to these things, there's a whole number of factors, including risk, not only to the community, but to the police officers in question, as to how they will be deployed.
Correct, and that's organic.
You certainly didn't receive any request for authorisation from Julie Frost in relation to the deployment of these men for the purpose of intelligence gathering.
No.
And you certainly didn't receive any request for approval from Julie Frost in relation to the deployment of these men at 7pm as opposed to 11pm.
No.
All right. You were shown some footage on the last occasion you gave evidence, and I think it would be fair to describe your reaction as one of perplexed when you saw that these men, upon immediately being deployed, going to first past 577.
Fair categorisation, yes.
And the reason for that, can I suggest, is because, as you just explained, that is totally inconsistent with what you would envisage and indeed authorise when these men were, in fact, authorised to go to the England on 9th November 2019.
Correct, yes.
You spoke previously, today I believe, about the nuances in terms of how the investigation was carried out. And
The investigation?
in terms of the deployment of these
Yes.
carried out. And that's obviously in the context of the plan. I think you described it as a short, sharp, decisive set of instructions or a snapshot. Now, in terms of the nuances, I think you, on a previous occasion, described the importance of the briefing. And I think you said the briefing is paramount to what we do and how we do it. It's again how we then work out the sort of intricate aspects of the plan. The plan can't reasonably outline every eventuality, but there needs to be some broader consideration around sort of some of the main things that may occur. In the context where, as you described it, this plan was effectively a snapshot, it was critical, wasn't it, that in terms of deploying these men from the Indigenous police station, the Julie Frost briefing with them properly set out the parameters as to what these men would do and how they would do it in accordance with the mission objectives of the plan set out and authorised.
Correct. It establishes the parameters and establishes an assimilation of expectations, or at least the perception of an assimilation of expectations.
And no doubt that was Julie Frost's responsibility as the remote sergeant to make sure in the exercise of her duties as the forward commander that these men understood and properly applied themselves to the task that they had ahead of them in accordance with this plan.
Correct, yes.
It certainly wouldn't be appropriate, for example, for Julie Frost to have laid dormant or lay silent if she, in the context of the briefing, saw that these men were going to go, for example, directly to House 577, if she knew that that was in direct contradistinction to the plan.
Agreed.
Now, we have had some evidence in this inquest that shortly before these men were deployed, the members of the IRT and later on Sergeant Donaldson were in the briefing room with Sergeant Frost. and that in effect, Constable Rolfe, was conducting, if you will, a briefing as to where the gentleman would go that evening, and that he had pointed out that they would go to House 577. Now, you would expect in those circumstances where such a briefing is to be conducted, Sergeant Frost, having known the plan, having devised the plan, and having effectively understood what she needed to do as the remote sergeant in that context, if there was to be any deviation from the plan, it was her responsibility, wasn't it, to correct it?
Correct.
Now, in the context where these members of the IRT and Sergeant Donaldson were deployed, if you will, on an urgent basis, and we have some evidence that the plan itself was only sent out to the members as they were in convoy to the Wendover police station.
Object to the suggestion that it is to what, can my learned friend clarifies what he means by on an urgent basis?
Well, I will clarify that. This certainly wasn't a deployment where people had a lot of time to consider all of the relevant intricacies that would go into the deployment of these people to Unity.
I'm not sure I quite get what time you're referring to, so perhaps re-ask the question, but if I interpret it insofar as, by my understanding, they arrived somewhere in the vicinity of 7 p.m. That presents a 4-hour period before the commencement of their duty, being a 4-hour period to work out the nuances of the framework. Am I answering you correctly, or?
I'll put it this way. The plan itself was confirmed by you, but we understand that that plan was not actually forwarded to the members of the IRT until they were actually travelling to the police station.
Correct, because it wasn't constructed until, whilst complete, the construction of it wasn't complete until later that afternoon.
That underscores the importance of very clear briefing and the laying out, if you will, of the parameters on which these members will be deployed into that actual community.
Agreed.
Now, we know, for example, that these members deployed with a number of instructions which seem to be inconsistent with the plan. One of those is that they were told to go out to the community intelligence gather. We're really good. We also know that they were deployed some 4 hours prior to the time, which is the appropriate time for them to be deployed. In circumstances where Sergeant Frost is effectively in the room while these men are talking about what they're going to do, if they're talking about going directly to House 577, it would have been reasonable that as the officers who are effectively reportable to Sergeant Frost, to assume that if they were saying that and she didn't intervene to correct them, that there was no difficulty, at least from her perspective, as to them doing that.
Reasonable assumption, yes.
Now that, I think, needs to be looked at in the context of what you talked about previously. I want to go back to how you viewed that footage in relation to these gentlemen going to House 577.
I object, Your Honour, on this basis. It just needs to be clarified. My learned friend, I'm slow to my feet. My learned friend put a proposition that Sergeant Frost told the members of the IRT that they should go out intelligence gathering, and that's not the evidence as I understand it. The evidence is that there was suggestion from one of the members that they needed to do some intel gathering, and that she said her response to them, please sit down, Mr. Miranda, while I'm making an objection. Her response to them was, if you come across him, then by all means lock him up.
If a suggestion was made that these men go out to the community intelligence gather and Sergeant Frost didn't correct them on that, it would have been fair to assume she had no difficulty with them going out to achieve that purpose.
Except that could be concluded.
If these gentlemen had said they were going to go directly to House 577 in her presence, it would be fair to assume that they would have been entitled to rely on that as certainly not excluding them from taking that course, and in some respects an implied approval of them taking that action.
Potentially.
She's a remote sergeant. She has a responsibility for ensuring, to the extent that she can, that full compliance is made with the plan that you endorsed.
Correct. However, I guess the qualifying criteria for me, and again, I wasn't there, so I don't know, and I'm not certainly privy to all the evidence that's been gleaned so far, but every participant within that plan has an obligation to that plan. So if there is evidence that they had an appreciation of the commander's intent, being the macro expectations, well then all the police officers have an obligation to comply with that, if that makes sense.
I understand that, but I suppose in the context of this particular day, where you've got a briefing preparing in relation to what we now know is something which is completely outside of the plan, namely the intelligence gathering, if the suggestion was made by one of the officers that they should go directly to House 577, and that wasn't, if you will, shut down, it would have been fair for these gentlemen to assume that that was something that was never spoken to their record.
Potentially.
Now, you've referred to the label, or it's been referred to, the label of intelligence gathering invariably throughout, and I think we've dealt with that at length in the context of your evidence when you gave evidence in response to questions from Dr. Dwyer. As I apprehended your evidence, you delved into what were the three-pronged approaches to intelligence gathering. One of those approaches was what you referred to as strategic intelligence gathering. And in contradistinction to that, you talked about operational intelligence gathering.
Yes.
And I think you described operational intelligence gathering as being somewhat more slow burn.
Yes.
Now, the contradistinction there was, as I understood it, that in relation to strategic intelligence gathering, that might include, for example, going directly to a house.
No, that was the distinction between tactical intelligence and operational intelligence.
You're quite right. So in terms of tactical intelligence, I think the point you made was that might include, for example, going directly to a house and figuring out who's there.
Potentially, but certainly not as a preferred course of action.
Sure. But it's certainly something that would fit within that region.
Potentially.
Well, you said in your evidence, that is where I say to someone, I need to go there right now, that house, tell me who's in there, is there any firearms, what's the antecedents of the people there, are there any children, so on and so on.
I don't know if I said I need to go there right now. I think what I said, or certainly my intention, was to say I need to know about that house now. What is there? What is the firearms? What's access? What's egress? Are there children? Proximity to schools? What's lighting look like? Any obstacles? What's the amenity? Other environmental issues? It'd be very, very unlikely or beneficial to physically attend to glean that information.
Right. I suppose the point I'm getting at, though, is that no matter what label you put on intelligence gathering, the instructions that these men ultimately receive, it's not informed necessarily just by the label, it's informed by all of the circumstances that are attended upon their briefing. In other words, everything that's said or not shut down, I suppose, in the pretty straight terms by Sergeant Frost, gives them an understanding of what it is they actually need to do when they're deployed, in this case, at 7 p.m, in contradistinction to the 11 p.m. start.
Sorry, could you repeat that proposition again? I'm sorry.
I'm confused by the number of compounds there. Everything that these men did has to be assessed, doesn't it, by reference to what actually occurred in the context of the briefing.
Correct.
So the decision to go directly to House 577 and the appropriateness of it might not necessarily be informed by the attachment of a label. It's informed by all the circumstances of what was discussed in the context of the briefing room of Sergeant Frost.
Agreed, but you've put the label on it in the context of it being an intelligence mission.
I apologise if I've done that. I'm just picking up and I'm trying to clarify in the context of what you said previously in evidence in chief about intelligence gathering. And so, do I take it you're agreeing with me that to the extent that what these men did may have at least been reasonably, whether they may have been reasonably entitled to believe it was within the remit, that has to be informed by what was said in the context of the briefing?
It's formed by the brief or lack thereof, yes.
Or lack thereof.
Correct.
Now, I want to change topics and deal with the question of contamination of evidence, because that was something that was obviously discussed on the last occasion that you gave evidence. Do you recall that?
In which context?
You recall being shown a text message, which I think contained the acronym IMAOP.
Yes.
And you were also asked about the gathering that occurred at Constable Ross' house on 11 November 2019.
Correct, yes.
And you were asked questions about the extent to which you considered that may have been in contravention of a general order relating to deaths in custody.
Correct, yes.
And you gave some views about the appropriateness of that conduct.
Based on the hypothetical, or not the hypothetical, the scenario as it was painted to, portrayed to me, yes.
Right. Now, one of the things you said about that was the real consequence of that is, again, eroding community confidence, bringing the agency into disrepute, and compromising any assessment of these matters, whether it's through the coronial or the criminal lens.
Yeah, and I'm not sure if that's a full picture of my evidence. Again, whether I conveyed it or intended to convey it, there's the potential and the perception surrounding that. So, yes.
And that's effectively what you said. I mean, you were talking about potentialities, because you weren't showing any evidence, for example, that would suggest that there were things discussed in the course of those events.
Correct.
And I'm referring there particularly to 11 November 2019. As I understood your evidence, it was the fact that these officers, particularly in the circumstances where one officer may have not provided a statement, that in and of itself gave rise to a concern about those potential consequences coming about.
Correct. An apprehension on the part of the community, potentially.
Now, you served some time within the NT Police Force as a prosecutor,
Correct, yes.
and so you probably understand, in addition to the responsibilities relating to the general order, that there's a real importance, and particularly in cases such as this, we have a death in custody, of ensuring that the accounts of witnesses are properly separated and are not discussed amongst witnesses.
Agreed.
And that arises not only in the criminal context, but as the case here, Coronial has to make findings about what actually occurred, at least on 9 November 2019, that it's important that that evidence, the evidence of critical witnesses, is properly separated and not discussed among them.
Correct, yes.
In relation to this particular investigation, after 10 November 2019, is it fair to say you didn't have any involvement in the investigation? Beyond this week.
No, I don't think I have. No.
So you're involved in the immediate aftermath and you made some critical decisions in relation
Correct,
to
yes.
how this tragic event ultimately dealt with.
Yes.
But after that, you would have understood particularly your role as defined one of the witness as a person in the chain of command in the Coronial investigation
Correct, yes.
and also in the criminal investigation.
Correct, yes.
And with that, you would have understood, particularly given this was a death in custody, the chain of command was going to be a front and centre consideration for her honour in terms of what actually happened on 9 November 2019,
Correct, yes.
what the scope of the remit was for these officers who attended on that day,
Yes.
what actually occurred with Sergeant Frost and these gentlemen when they were in the police station on 9 November 2019.
Correct, yes.
Right. And so you would have understood that not only your own evidence, but that of Sergeant Frost would have been extremely important.
Yes.
And that it would have been very important for you to abstain, if you will, from having discussions with Sergeant Frost about what actually happened on 9 November 2019.
Sorry, say that again?
You would have understood that it was important
Yes.
to abstain from
Yes.
discussions with Sergeant Frost
Yes.
about what actually occurred on 9 November
Yes.
2019. Because you probably understand that, for all the reasons we've already gone through, that would have the effect of contaminating,
Correct.
directly or indirectly, her evidence or your evidence.
Yes, correct.
Now, you did have some discussions with Sergeant Frost, though, in the month following this particular and tragic event.
In respect to the material matters contained within this?
Well, no, I'll come to that in a moment.
Okay.
You did have some discussions with Sergeant Frost in relation to did you, firstly, I'll draw that. You had some discussions with Sergeant Frost in the month following this tragic event after 10 November 2019.
Many conversations with Sergeant Frost is within my chain of command and an officer in charge of my police station.
Right. And some of those were concerned with welfare.
Predominantly, yes.
Now, is it the case that in December 2019 you had a discussion with Sergeant Frost where the concept of the plan having deviated came up and was discussed between you and Sergeant Frost?
So December when, sorry?
December 2019.
I don't recall.
Now, we have a statement from Julie Frost
Yes.
that was given on 5 December 2019. Now, the reason why I ask you that is, in the course of that statement interview, she was asked a question about whether you'd had any discussions with her around the deviation from the original plan. And she said, no, we haven't. Look, actually, I don't. Just 2 days ago, so I'm assuming from that, given the date, it was 3 December.
Yes.
He asked how I was going, and I said, look, I'm still wondering why the members did what they did. And he said, yeah, I'm just sort of learning that. You know, that plan was deviated, so, but up until then we haven't actually had any conversations about anything at all other than what a welfare perspective.
Yeah, look, I'm not sure. I certainly don't recall that. But Julie's a lady of integrity, and if she said that, then potentially that was the case. It's, I sent, if I could finish, I sent Julie some flowers, had a conversation with her from a welfare perspective, and I recall having conversations with Julie where, I still, to today, haven't looked at most of the body worn in the interest of not contaminating my recollection of events. So I'm pretty confident there was a clear understanding that we wouldn't talk about the material matters within that, but maybe as a throwaway, there's clearly something went wrong here. I'm not too sure, but...
So I'll just work through that. And just bear in mind, I'm not suggesting that you're setting out to directly interfere or contaminate Sergeant Frost evidence. But accepting that this statement was made on 5 December and she was talking about an incident some 2 days earlier, you accept that it's likely to be the case, even though you don't recall that that conversation was something that was likely to have occurred at around 3 December 2019?
You've outlined a very vague set of proposition, as I indicated. If that's the advice Julie has provided contemporaneously, close to the event, then perhaps a conversation, as I just outlined, may have occurred. I don't recall it, and that's all I can say, I guess.
Well, just in terms of that, because she says, it seems to be the case that what she's suggesting is that she raised the issue with you. I'm still wondering why other members did what they did. To which your response is, I'm just sort of learning that, that claim is deviated. So, now, that's obviously very limited information about a conversation she described. But, and again, without suggesting that you were intentionally seeking to contaminate her evidence, you can see, given what you've already said in relation to all the other hypothetical scenarios, that this was something that had a real capacity, given that it seems to be the case that expressing disbelief about what actually happened with this plan, how that might have the capacity, bearing in mind that she hasn't finished her statement-taking process,
Yes.
to have informed or potentially influenced how she went about providing her statement, whether directly or indirectly.
Object. There's just another important piece of information, and that is that by the time of that conversation, a couple of days past the 5th of December, Sergeant Frost had done a 2-hour record of interview with police on the 13th of
I haven't
November
suggested a breach of the general laws at all.
2000.
I'm just focusing on the question of contamination.
and 19.
And what council assistant is doing, as has been done on behalf of Constable Rolfe, she is pointing out that there is in existence a 2-hour statement taken from Julie Frost before this conversation took place, or is said to have taken place. And I note that I have that lengthy interview attaching another statement from the 29th of November 2019 for Superintendent Knowles, which also predates this conversation.
Correct. And all I'm saying is, I'm not talking about breach of the general law, I'm talking about the discussion of evidence, because this officer seems to probably accept something which has the capacity to inform contamination of evidence, and indeed that is accepted. The discussion of evidence about ongoing investigations certainly not approved of by him. So, I mean, I think the possibilities, I haven't suggested at all that this was a breach of general law. In any event.
Sure, and also that we have two very lengthy accounts that from both witnesses that predate this conversation.
Well, that's certainly true, but certainly afterwards there's an interview given, since we're going to delve into the detail, which in some respects detracts from the original account given, but that's ultimately a matter of submission. Now, the point I was ultimately getting at is, you can appreciate, whether directly or indirectly, how these types of discussions, particularly ones where you're talking about the extent to which you don't understand how this plan deviated, how that might inform how Julie Frost might ultimately give her evidence.
Yeah, look, again, I don't recall the conversation, so I'm not accepting it's occurred. As I indicated, I accept that Julie Frost has provided an account that's contemporaneous. You've provided a very vague factual narrative or narrative there. It could have been a situation where I've assessed Julie from a welfare perspective and went, something's went wrong here. Clearly we're going to have a process to glean what that was. And I guess I've been very conscious not to engage in any dialogue with anyone that's of any material benefit. Or
You certainly have, and you're certainly not suggesting that you would intentionally seek to contaminate evidence, as I've said. But again, approaching this on a hypothetical basis, you can approach every other hypothetical situation.
Yes.
And approaching that statement in the way that I've just read it to you, you can agree that statements of that nature would have the capacity to influence, and as I've said, directly or indirectly, how Julie Frost might approach giving further statements.
potentially.
And because you've acknowledged chain of command in this particular case is critical.
Yes.
It's likely to be the type of evidence that was going to be critical not only in the criminal context but also in this Coronial context.
Yes.
When it came to the question of the deployment of these officers and the proper briefing of them, certainly the case isn't it, that in terms of ensuring that these men were properly instructed, consistently with the plan, the buck stopped with Frost.
Correct, yes.
I don't have any further questions.
The remaining counsel to, sorry,
That's okay.
needs to read. And we've also got, we've also Mr Sutner on the phone, just not to be forgotten.
Sorry, Your Honour, I missed what you said, but you did mention me.
No, that's right. Stay there. No. The evidence so far, and the evidence from Commander Furness.
Senior Sergeant Furness, correct, yes.
Sergeant Furness. The effect of his evidence that the emphasis was on the arrest of Kumanjayi Walker. Do you accept that?
Well, I accept if that's his evidence and his interpretation, but it certainly wasn't the emphasis that I placed.
And indeed, the decision to deploy had been made prior to any written plan being put in place. Is that
Correct,
right?
yes.
Yeah. And you did not assess this as high risk because essentially it was in relation to the arrest I'm talking about, it was essentially a general duties arrest, type of
A
arrest.
routine matter in my mind, yes.
A routine matter. If it was a high risk assessment, then there are a lot more hoops to jump through, aren't there?
Correct, yes.
And that would mean that TRG has to be involved.
Not have to be involved, but certainly be engaged, yes. Sorry, yes, yes.
And you'd have to speak to the Assistant Commissioner.
Correct, yes.
And if that occurred, a detailed plan and justification first and plan would have to be devised, is that right?
No. So justification, yes, but the plan could still be a snap order similar to the snap order that was presented, obviously denoting it as being a high risk as opposed to general support. And TRG would then develop further plans, potentially.
Before they actually deployed.
Potentially.
Yes, right. In this case, and if you take it from us, it would appear that on what Senior Sergeant Furness said, Sergeant McCormack, now Sergeant McCormack was under the pump in many regards that day, wasn't he? Yeah.
I'm not too sure, but...
Well, he had to deal with all the alcohol shop deployments, didn't he?
Correct. I acknowledge there's a lot going on, as is the case every day.
Yeah. So, your decision that it was not high risk, but it was effectively a routine arrest vis-a-vis Mr. Walker, is that right?
Correct, yes.
The one purpose of the deployment, yes?
No, the deployment had 5 purposes.
Yes. Well, it was as a result of Julie Frost contacting you in relation to fatigue,
One, yes.
property offences,
Yes.
the medical clinic,
Correct?
the arrest of Walker,
Yes.
and
Rakisha.
Keisha, of course. And Keisha featured very much in your mind, is that right?
Yes, correct.
Because you had a situation whereby, as you've given in evidence earlier today, that even when a person has finished their court obligations, the risk in the context of the family safety framework situation is that first engagement, is that right?
That's the most critical time, yes.
Yeah, and you need to be careful and try and reintegrate, have safeguards, fallback situations, etc. Is that right?
Agreed, yes.
And so in this case, the issues rose even more because in fact he'd absconded, he'd cut off his bracelet, and he'd gone back without any supervision at all. Is that right?
Correct.
And notwithstanding the fact that there was some perception that Rakesh was on board with the deceased, you well know from those situations that one of the very problems in those sort of relationships is the volatility and how quickly things can change.
Correct, yes.
He could see you out the shop talking to another boy.
Correct.
He could drink at the funeral, etc. Is that right?
Yes.
So it was very much in the front of your mind that it was necessary to get this arrest effected. Is that right?
Correct. Well, one of the factors, yes.
One of the factors, yes. What? The evidence so far seems to indicate that really the first opportunity to be aware of the plan that Julie Frost put together with the assistance of Sergeant McCormack, the first opportunity for the IRT members to appreciate that was when they got to you and Demur.
Accepted, yes.
Yeah. And up until that time, it was in their minds that the primary purpose was the arrest of Kumanjayi Walker.
I can't comment on that.
Well, already there'd been attempts to arrest or information in Alice Springs to go to the Walbury camp. Yes. There was on the promise system that he was a priority arrest target. Yes. Kirstenfeld and Rolf had been involved in the Walbury camp attempt. Yeah.
I don't know these things. I accept what you're saying. If this is the evidence.
Okay. Now, notwithstanding that you delegated to Julie Frost to come up with the plan, what stopped you from sending an email from your iPhone or a message to Sergeant Finesse simply on terms like this? Because this was an IRT deployment, but it was on a general duties basis, wasn't it?
Yes.
One, the primary purpose of the deployment is to provide general duties support to Julie Frost at Ewan Demur because, and give a reason, fatigue, clinic, break-ins, the funeral, and that they are to commence their duty at 11 p.m. Two, the IRT and Sergeant Donaldson are to be engaged only in a general duties capacity. You could have done that, couldn't you?
Well, in terms of your question specifically, could have I, should have I sent an email? I had a conversation with Furness and, can I finish please? And Sergeant McCormack, where I clearly articulated those matters and I was comfortable that it was a simulation of my expectation there. Should have I sent an email? Perhaps, but they were police officers on duty getting paid to do a job. I communicated my expectations and I expected that there was a compliance with that and there was an assimilation of what my expectations were. I wish I followed it up with an email, quite frankly, but I didn't.
You spoke to them on a speakerphone in a busy police station. There was a lot going on. An email set out, and I'll go through the remainder of what I might suggest, and
yes.
I'm not applying for your job. So IRT engaged only in a general duty capacity, although they take their equipment, they are only to use that equipment if the situation escalates and there is authorisation justifying its use. Because if they're just engaged or deployed in a general duties capacity, then really one wouldn't expect them to take rifles just out into the community, would you?
There's a lot of moving parts to your question there. So if I answer
What I'm
that,
trying to say is,
well, to answer that part of the question, the expectation is yes, they would, because you don't know what's occurring. It's 370 kilometres away. The general support deployment could become something else down the track if circumstances change. So the expectation is yes, they do carry all their equipment.
They take
with
them up there, but they only deploy the additional equipment if it's approved or authorised.
Correct, yes.
Because what I'm suggesting is this: when the TRG are deployed, they're deployed in a high risk situation. And they really, whenever they're deployed, they do take their gear and they are going to be either carrying it or wearing it. The IRT is quite different because they go out in two different capacities, either in the general duties capacity or their IRT capacity. That's correct?
TRG go out in two different capacities, general support and high risk as well.
Yeah.
So, yes.
And presumably when they're going out in general support, they don't take their additional equipment out.
Depends on where that general support is. If they're doing a general support operation in Darwin, perhaps they don't. I don't know, that's a question for them. But certainly if they were coming to Alice Springs for general support, they'll still bring their tactical equipment, again, for the obvious reasons that if something occurs that then requires an escalation of the deployment, the kit's available and it's not 1,500 kilometres away.
I'm trying to get to the point. The point is this: they're being deployed many hours away from Alice Springs. It would be a small thing to do at that early stage when they first meet at the police station to have a clear direction from you set out in dot point form that this is the purpose. You are only to do this. You are not to go on intelligence or active pursuit of them, because that might ruin the 530 plan, etc., and set it out plainly and clearly.
So I guess what you're... Sorry?
Because without that written document, there is room for miscommunication and evading communication.
What I guess I'm interpreting through your question is the proposal or expectation that I wrote the plan. That's effectively what I could glean from your questioning. And as I have indicated, I operate in a chain of command and control environment, and there were a number of police officers on duty getting paid to do a job at a particular time. I communicated what my expectations were, and I accepted and expected there was an assimilation and compliance with those expectations. I wish in hindsight, given clearly what tragically occurred, that I had documented some of these things, but I wouldn't do that as a matter of course, because I would never have any time off. I'm getting these calls quite frequently. So you expect the police officers operating under your command to do what you've conveyed.
Would you expect them therefore, for example, to document what it is that you have told them and send, back an email confirming your conversation or something like that?
Potentially, Your Honour. It's it's one of the processes that police do. It's one of the fundamental requirements of police to document the things that we're told and requested, and whether that's notebooks or otherwise. So again, they're questions for the officers concerned, but
Someone should have documented the decision to deploy though, and what that entailed.
correct. Well, again, they didn't get into the specifics of the deployment, but the deployment was documented. It was documented by Acting Sergeant McCormick, and then subsequently documented by Sergeant Frost, albeit within a snap order format. And the format and the order provided by Sergeant Frost aligned broadly with my expectations.
But McCormack wasn't recording or documenting documenting your conversation. He was producing a different document.
Correct. He ultimately produced an administrative aid to assist Sergeant Frost in creating the snap order. But again, any police officer, well, most police officers know the importance of documenting things, whether it's in a notebook or otherwise. But
where the IRT is being recorded, the initial conversation where that is communicated should be documented.
correct, it should have been documented by me, albeit off duty at the time, in terms of what I assert I said, and equally it should have been documented by the people on the other end of the conversation. So there's now ambiguity as to what the expectations were, but clearly we have ambiguity now. But
Because in fact you were the one that made the decision for the deployment, and you were the one that had the discussions with Julie Frost, and indeed your thought process is very, very clearly set out. I think it was about 90 paragraphs you set out in a typed notes which were the basis for your statement. And all I'm trying to suggest is that that clarity of thought could have been set out in a very brief email or iPhone message that this is what we require and this is why, knowing that the police station was busy on Saturday afternoon, and this is so there can be complete clarity of the purpose of the deployment on that general duties basis.
and the short answer to your question is I wish I had.
Yes. Now the other thing, and whether this happens, Sergeant Frost has indicated that she did say to the police officers as they left, if you are doing intel and come across him, lock him up absolutely. Now, does a remark, and just off the bat, but does a remark like that then provide a degree of ambiguity to the operative police officers in the context where, in your mind, there's going to be a dawn arrest, and you've got this sort of almost a throwaway line that, well, if you come up, what does come across someone mean? Does it mean, you know, he's down at the shop, he's down at the water hole, swimming pool? Is that coming across? What? It does.
It's difficult for me to definitively give any clarity to these representations from Sergeant Frost or anyone else because I'm not a party to them. But to me, if you look at it through an appropriate lens, that is, they shouldn't have been at work from 7 o'clock to 11. That's when they should have been formulating the intricacies of the plan. Come 11 o'clock, if there was a chance discovery, for a lack of a better term, or come across them,
They're just doing their high-vis stuff.
pull over a vehicle for an RBT and there he is in the vehicle, well then common sense would dictate if it's safe then we effect an arrest. That I think is the chance discovery, or if you come across him, not now let's manufacture a situation which will potentially bring about a chance discovery. That's, I guess, the only way I could broadly interpret it, being not a party to the conversation.
Is that my question? So, Your Honour.
Your Honour, there are 3 more council.
Yes.
I'm sorry, I just indicate, just for planning purposes, because I know the time, there are 3 more council for questions. They are Mr Sutner, Miss Oslands and Mr Hutton, and then I have some brief questions in reply. Oh, I'm so sorry, Mr Freckleton of Senior Counsel, thank you.
Yes. We might go to Mr Sutner, just because you can't see him and I don't want to overlook him. Mr Sutner?
Your Honour, I can't hear you very well. Did you
Oh,
say that
sorry.
You're going to, did you say you're going to me now?
Yes, I was going to give you an opportunity now, Mr Sutner.
Thank you, Your Honour. Superintendent, my name is John Sutner. I represent Sergeant Bowen. And I'm sorry that I'm doing it in this way. I must also apologize to you for the fact that I haven't heard very well a lot of what is transpired this evening. So if I repeat something that has been asked of you, please be understanding. Superintendent, first, am I correct that there is no place in the Northern Territory Police Force for racism, sexism, or dishonesty?
Agreed.
And am I correct that you are absolutely firm about this?
Yes.
And if any of that conduct came to your attention, you would intervene, you would discipline the offender, and there would be a record of that?
Broadly speaking, yes. I'd like to think, as I said, my evidence in chief, that I would try to explore how or why we've gotten to the position that we've got to. So, depending on the nature of the comment, depending on what I could glean through my inquiry, may dictate the course of action subsequently taken. But again, that's too broad of a question.
Well, if it came to your attention and there was an offender, you would see the offender disciplined, correct?
Well, I just think I just answered that. Depends on the nature of the comments, the circumstances gleaned through my inquiries as a result of that.
All right. But we would have a record of that. If it had occurred, we'd have a record, correct?
Potentially, yes.
And when you were examined by Mr. Bolton, you seem to concede that there is racism in the Alice Springs police station based on your common sense, and that is, it's common sense because there's racism in the community, therefore there must be racism in the Alice Springs police station.
No, I didn't ask that question, and I object to this question. It's not even the effect of the evidence, Your Honour.
And equally, I don't think I concede.
I'm objected to the question.
Sorry.
There's an objection to that, Mr. Suttner. Mr. Bolton's advising that he didn't ask that question, nor is that the effect of the evidence.
All right, well, let me cut it short. Can I accept that certainly in respect of Sergeant Bowen's, you have never had a complaint of racism, sexism, or dishonesty? Is that correct?
Agreed, yes.
And you have never observed any such behavior by him? Is that correct?
Agreed, yes.
Okay. Now, you spoke of the IRT having been deployed, I think you said 10 times. Is that correct?
I may have said 10 times, but I think I might have said, I can't say definitively how many times, but half a dozen to 10, correct.
And they were all successful deployments?
Correct.
And in fact, you wrote to Sergeant Bowens complimenting him on the conduct of the IRT in these deployments.
I've commended them for a job well done on a number of occasions, yes.
Yes. Now, you were asked about their budget. Where does their budget come from?
I'm afraid I can't answer that question. That wasn't within my portfolio responsibility, so that's a more appropriate question for Superintendent Vickery.
I see. Okay. Now, a little earlier this afternoon, you said that, you didn't use these words, but you said that in hindsight, it would have been better if you had documented exactly what the IRT should have done in Yulin. correct?
I simply said I wish I had, and then there'd be
Yes, you wish you had.
little question or a little concern around the clear ambiguity that we have here now.
Yes. Well, let me ask you this. Bearing in mind that you had in mind a 5 a.m. invasion of a private home, exactly what would your document have said?
Well, firstly, I don't contend the use of the term invasion of a private home was what my intention was. But the document would have been effectively what it was, and that was what was produced by Sergeant Frost, a snap order that outlined clearly what my expectations were, constructed in a SMEAC broad format that had some appreciation of some of the objectives inherent within the plan.
So are you saying now that Sergeant Frost's plan was adequate from your point of view?
As a mechanism to articulate the commander's intent and the broad expectations that were associated with the deployment, yes, I do concede, as I indicated in my evidence earlier. How far down the rabbit hole do you go in terms of the extra information that you could potentially incorporate within the plan? But I'll reinforce that the snap nature of the plan is that it's a short, sharp, decisive instrument that is designed to highlight the broad sort of macro expectations within the deployment. The nuances are built with once the specialist team or the additional police personnel arrive on the scene. That's when they get into an operational appreciation process to start mapping out the sort of nuance and intricacies within the plan.
All right, look, that's all a little bit about my intelligence, but if I can just get this straight, these broad strokes of this plan involve the IRT going into a private home at 5 a.m. Is that not an invasion of a private home?
That assumes that the expectation was that they would go into the private home. The expectation was that there was a deployment to the primary house and then subsequently to the other houses at 5 a.m, between 5 a.m. and 5:30, whereby through the planning appreciation process, the preferred course of action would be contain, knock, engage, surrender. That wouldn't have inherent in that an invasion of the premise. There's a whole multitude of options that would have occurred before what we consider being the course of last resort, which is a forced entry into a premise.
Okay. So did the plan contemplate that the IRT may have been informed that Mr. Walker wasn't in the house?
Sorry, can you kindly repeat that question again?
Did the plan contemplate that the IRT may have been informed that Mr. Walker wasn't in the house?
I'm afraid I still don't understand the question.
Did the plan contemplate the possibility that on knocking, the IRT might be informed, or whoever knocked might be informed, that Mr. Walker was not in the house?
Oh, quite possibly. We had 5 houses. I still contend that there's a high probability and reasonable belief on my part that the most probable location at 5 a.m. or 5:30 a.m. would have been asleep in Mr. Walker's bed, Kumanjayi Walker's bed within Kumanjayi Walker's residential address.
All I want to know is, was it contemplated that if somebody said he's not there, that the IRT was just to go away?
No, and similarly in terms of the interactions the afternoon before, notwithstanding it wasn't permissible in terms of the time, but the manner, not the manner, but as was demonstrated, you engage the residents at a particular location. Quite often you obtain by consent, a by consent position by the residents to have a look through the house to support their assertion that he's not there. Once we're satisfied that the house is clear, then we attend the next location and work our way through that as well. But that's the if-then planning. So it's whilst we're establishing what our if-then responses may be, the afternoon before we say if we attend this location and we knock and we have an opposition, what then? If we attend and he's not there, where to then? So that's the sort of extent of consideration that needs to be around that. But again, I can't simply accept that the expectations were that they would have had to forcibly enter the premise. That's potentially one scenario, but a highly unlikely scenario.
Was none of that dealt with in the plan?
No, look, you can't have a plan that covers off on every remote eventuality. I mean, as in the written document.
Was none of that dealt with in the plan?
Clearly, if you look at Clearly, the plan doesn't articulate that.
That's where the witness be given an opportunity by Mr. Suttner to answer the question.
I know it's difficult, Mr. Suttner, because you can't see. So if there's some delay, you don't know why. But I think the superintendent's trying to answer that question for you.
It appeared to me that he was trying to evade it, Your Honour, but I'll listen.
Okay. All the intricate aspects that would be gleaned through an if-then appreciation thinking were not incorporated in the plan. No. The plan was a broad-based blueprint to what would be occurring.
Thank you, Your Honour. I have no further questions.
Thanks, Mr. Suttner. Ms. Oslands?
Thank you, Your Honour. Superintendent, my name's Sally Oslands, and in these proceedings I'm representing the Northern Territory Police Association.
Good afternoon.
I just wanted to ask you some brief questions. The first thing was about resourcing. I understand that at the time, that is in November 2019, you were responsible for what has been referred to in these proceedings as the relief pool.
Yes.
Can you just explain briefly what exactly the relief pool is?
So it was one of a number of iterations that we've had over time around trying to provide surge and respite into remote police stations. It was a cadre operating out of Alice Springs that backfilled gaps. Gaps arising from courses, arising from illness, arising from recreational leave, but then also to fulfil the requirements across the five police posts, and then to provide a surge capacity on an as-needs basis. So the relief pool at that point in time was anywhere between 8 to 12, but I think at the relevant time it comprised of 8 people.
So sorry, just so I got this straight. So there were, in a given period, between 8 and 12 members who were not gazetted to a particular station or operational post, if you like, and they were able to relieve in the different communities or in those different capacities that you just outlined.
Yeah, they were gazetted. I think they were gazetted to Alice Springs, but recognised that they were attached for all intensive purposes to my area. And it's still... It was a relief pool that didn't necessarily have the same people in there, although there was some that provided continuity. It might have been some that said, oh, well, for the next 3 months, I'm willing and able to provide some support to my remote colleagues, and we will work in there. The SPRSU, as it was referred to at the time.
So the relief pool that you were in charge of, that you say, and I understand the variances that you've just described, so around 8 to 12 members, that was just for relief in the southern region?
Yes.
Yep. And was there another relief pool that serviced more northern areas?
Not under my command.
Are you aware of whether or not those relief pools exist?
Backfilled and assist Barclay from time to time, given it was under the same command, but there was a rarity. It was more within the 11 police stations that I had portfolio responsibility.
Sorry, my question was more focused on, there's a Southern Command relief pool. Was there also a top end relief pool? And
I'm not sure.
Not sure.
Sorry.
Now, we've heard some evidence in the course of the inquest about how quite often the remote stations, including Yuendamu, didn't have their full number of gazetted staff most of the time. And I see you nodding.
Sorry, more common than not, yes.
More common than not. And that these relief members were often used not for just short-term reliefs, but might also provide a longer period of relief, like you've described for rec leave or
Correct.
sick leave. And is it the case that sometimes relief pool members would just go and sit in an empty gazetted position if the gazetted position couldn't be filled, for example?
Yes.
So, as I understand the situation in Yuendamu in November 2019, not all of those members that were posted there at the time were gazetted members.
Correct.
And there's been some evidence, at least from, and I think Julie Frost and also Anne Jolly have given some evidence about there being difficulties with the number of hours that members are required to work because they're effectively on call 24/7. And when you have those relief members, they often leave the community on their RDOs or short periods of leave and return to Alice Springs, for example.
And that's not constrained to the relief members, that extends to the substantive members there as well.
Sure. So would you agree that it's often the case that members don't get to take their RDOs?
Yeah, correct.
Yes.
So that
work overtime to the extent that they're essentially doubling their normal shift roster, if you like.
not uncommon, yes.
Not uncommon. The other thing I just wanted to ask you about is we've heard this term, and I won't take you to the documents, but that when members are posted to remote stations, there's an expectation that they will be reasonably available.
Correct, yes.
Can you just explain, well, first of all, what your understanding of that is and what your experience is in terms of when a member is considered to be reasonably available, or alternatively, it's reasonable for them to say they're not available?
Okay, it's an industrial term. It's somewhat broad and a little bit vague, I guess. It's, I think, contained within the consent agreement. It effectively doesn't constrain police members to their police post whilst off duty, but it effectively contends that if they are there, they're going to be provide themselves that they'll be reasonably deployable on an as-needs basis, but certainly doesn't constrain them to stay in remote communities if they've got to attend Alice Springs for, certain appointments, even for just general respite and recreation.
Sure. So in circumstances where members being reasonably available is relied on to provide the communities with the service, what's the contingency plan if members are unavailable for reasonable and allowable reasons? What's the contingency plan?
I guess there's a number of contingencies that we have in place, and we have a watch commander on duty at any given time. At the time we didn't have a TDS, but today we have a TDS. They regulate the capability and capacity of members to respond at a particular time. If we have a situation that will exceed the capability of the particular police station because we have a number of members affording themselves the opportunity for respite and aren't deployable, well then there's opportunity to surge from Alice Springs, there's opportunity to surge from adjacent police stations. So that's one of the contingencies. There's the other contingency, again, as a planned matter, is potentially through me in my portfolio role and responsibility to oversight and regulate the welfare of members is I could send a surge deployment out through the SBRSU.
What's the SB?
That's the cadre that we're talking about.
Yep.
To backfill, as was the case on this occasion with LFAO and PARBs. So that's another contingency option.
So just on that with LFAO and PARBs, by them coming into UN Demu, that obviously then left their posting unattended.
Well, they didn't have a posting per se. They were deployable on a as-needs basis. At the time, they were deployed to Nirrupi, being a police post, which is not a police station, which is not ordinarily filled, but it's one that we provide some support to, again, on an as-needs basis. And in the case of Nirrupi at this particular occasion, it was because we had a carnival or something similar that required the police to be there. So they weren't effectively abandoning their post. They were then redeployed for a greater, more pressing need, which was the support at UNAMU.
The other thing I wanted to speak to you about, and it perhaps flows from you would have had, we've heard evidence during this inquest, and you'd no doubt be aware in any event that members, particularly those in remote stations that are working those long hours, regularly report fatigue and feel stressed and things of that nature from the nature of the work, but also the long hours. And fatigue's quite a common thing, isn't it?
Far too common.
Now, you gave some evidence on the last occasion about welfare or members safeguarding themselves against stress, trauma and other matters like that. And the comment that you made was that early in your career, welfare support, that is, was more around the social club or social interactions, or probably some unhealthy practices around liquor consumption and things such as that. There's been an evolution since those early days in my career, but so those sorts of things aren't the go-to now. It's more around support services and things like that. Do you recall giving that evidence?
Correct, yes.
So what support services were you referring to?
Welfare support, chaplaincy, psychologists and psychiatrists, whether they're Northern Territory Police or outsourced to other service providers, peer support programs.
I'll come back to that if I might in a minute. You said welfare support services. Now, the police force employs welfare officers, doesn't it?
Correct, yes.
Yeah. Now, is there a full-time welfare officer in Alice Springs?
At the present time?
Yes.
I'm not too sure. I'm in Nullarbor is where I operate at the present time, so I can't answer that question, I'm afraid.
Was there a welfare officer in November 2019?
Senior Constable Brodie Anderson had that portfolio role, whether she was there or not at the time. Yes, she was. I remember briefing her when she came into the police station post the situation. Herself and Chaplain Rob Weeks attended the police station shortly thereafter the event.
Sure. Did you consider that full-time welfare officer is a necessary position for members in the Alice Springs region?
Critical, yes.
And obviously the same would apply in Darwin and Northern regions that it's critical for there to be a full-time welfare officer available to members.
Welfare officer or officers, it's, yes.
Sure. Now you also mentioned psychologists. Is there a full-time psychologist in the Alice Springs region?
I don't think so. I don't think I'm sufficiently placed to give you a firm indication on that question. Again, operating in Nullarbor at the present time.
Were you aware of whether or not there was a full-time psychologist
I don't think there was.
in Alice Springs in
No,
November?
I think we had the chaplain and the and Brodie.
Do you know, having been a supervisor in the Alice Springs region for a long period of time, how members access those services?
By their own accord or through referral. So if we have a critical incident, there's an obligation on the part of myself as a line manager to submit a critical incident notification through to ESS. That then triggers some responses from ESS.
Sure.
But again, it's not uncommon for members of their own accord to reach out.
Now, you've previously given some evidence, acknowledging that the events in 2019 had a deep impact on everyone in the Alice Springs area, obviously, including you. In your opinion, back in 2019 in November, immediately following this critical incident, were there sufficient support services available to members in Alice Springs?
I honestly can't recall. I'm sorry. I do know that we had a rotation of welfare support here down from Darwin for a period of time. How long that was, I'm not too sure. I was quite regularly as a participant within this matter, receiving calls from psychologists and ESS representatives doing well checks on me. As a manager, I was doing well checks on my people.
Sure. Did you refer anybody? You were just talking about having an obligation following a critical incident to refer members, your subordinate members. Do you recall referring anybody post 9 November 2019 for welfare support?
Senior Constable Smith and Han were referred arising from what's commonly referred to as the axe incident. I don't think we made any formal referrals. It was, and again, I can't answer the question definitively. I don't think I did, but I think it was because there was so much wraparound from ESS at that point in time that it was assumed by me that everyone was sufficiently captured.
And just one final thing on that. Are you aware of any debrief that occurred with any of the members following the 9 November 2019?
No, and as I expressed in my evidence in chief, that's something that I've genuinely struggled with and continue to today, 3 years on. Not acknowledging, or certainly not saying that I don't acknowledge the complexities around undertaking such a thing, but I've found the fact that it's taken almost 3 years for me to have some answers in my mind in terms of some of the factors that has been really hard for me to take.
Sure. The last thing I wanted to ask you about, and I won't go over and over it because certainly Miss O'Neill took you through the general order in relation to executing warrants, but I just wondered if you could clarify, on the last occasion when you gave some evidence, you agreed with certain propositions put in relation to whether or not officers had a discretion in relation to arresting where there was a warrant in existence. And specifically, one of the propositions put to you was, even if it's not technically allowed under the legislation, there's still room for common sense and cultural sensitivity, isn't there? And you said, yeah, correct. You then went on, before and after that proposition, to indicate, certainly on my reading of your evidence anyway, that there is no discretion for members when they're faced with a person who they know has a warrant. And I just wondered if you could, first of all, clarify what the position is, and secondly, how the clear message is given to members in relation to whether or not they have a discretion.
So, Roland, the witness can, of course, continue to give his opinion about what it means. It's a legal issue that the court will determine based on your understanding.
Sure. I guess perhaps Miss Oslands is concerned with what the police understand.
Sure.
Well, perhaps I'll approach it a different way. Superintendent, you'd agree that the police organisation is one which relies on subordinate members being given and following clear directions and orders.
Correct, yes.
And there's an obligation for members of the police force to follow directions and orders given to them by superior officers.
Correct, yes.
And they are obliged to follow general orders issued by the commissioner or properly delegated person in relation to how they discharge their duties.
Correct, yes.
And we've heard evidence, I wasn't going to go back over it all in great detail, but we've seen that there is in fact a general order which dictates that members don't have a discretion when effecting an arrest on a warrant.
Agreed, yes.
I just wanted some clarification of your evidence as a superintendent who clearly gives direction and orders to subordinate officers. Your evidence in some parts was that there might be room for discretion, and in other parts of your evidence you've acknowledged that the general order sets out there is no discretion.
Yeah, and look, your former question, I can't recall my evidence specifically, but I accept what you're saying is as indicated within the transcript. But I certainly don't recall that, and certainly wasn't my intention to convey that there is no discretion. Notwithstanding, I took discretion contrary to the explicit instructions, and I took discretion through the lens of applying a common sense, culturally sensitive response. Very similarly, and although probably more liberally than is a reasonable or appropriate in the circumstance, but through the scenario that was put to me earlier, notwithstanding the determination within the general order, quite clearly we would exercise discretion and not immediately act if there was a safety issue. So I guess whilst it's explicit, in my mind, common sense should dictate there still is some flexibility around that.
And do you see that as being the case for members of all ranks? Like, would you expect a probationary constable to exercise a discretion in the same way that you might as an experienced superintendent?
Yes, what I would expect is that the policy and statutory framework is addressed in the interests of ensuring that there's no ambiguity. That's what I'd expect, I guess, but I would encourage and consider it appropriate for any police officer of any rank to apply common sense with safety as their paramount consideration when interpreting any general order, notwithstanding the explicit nature contained within that general order.
There's a risk, isn't there? Like you've just said, it's an explicit general order, so there's a real risk that an officer who seeks to exercise a discretion which is contrary to an express provision in a general order is at risk of criticism, disciplinary action, things of that nature.
Agreed.
So you'd agree then that the general order needs to set out very clearly what the obligations are, and in the absence of any discretion included in the general order, that the officer is obliged to follow the general order.
Agreed, yes.
Yes, they're all my questions. Thank you. Thank you, Stephen.
Thank you.
Yes, Mr. Hutton?
Thank you. I know the time would be convenient to have the afternoon break, or would you like me to?
How long are you going to be, Mr. Hutton?
I think about 15 minutes, right?
And then we have Dr. Freckleton, Your Honour.
Yes. Look, I think we'll take your 15 minutes
Sure.
and then we'll have a quick break and see how we go.
Please. Superintendent Nobbs, my name is Hutton and I appear on behalf of NT Health. Good afternoon. In early November 2019, there was an escalation of incidents of property crime at the nurses' accommodation in Uendaba. Is that correct?
I was only aware of an escalation in property crime on the morning of the 9th, was when it was conveyed to me, and I had the impression that was relative to the night before.
You became aware of it on the morning of the 9th of November?
Correct, yes.
You weren't aware of the And there have been incidents on the previous days.
I wasn't aware of that, no.
All right.
I may have been, I don't think I was aware of that, but
Or perhaps I can summarise the evidence before Her Honour, and you can tell us if you were aware of it. On the 6th of November, the clinic manager's house had been broken into. On the 7th of November, the clinic manager's car had been broken into. On the 8th of November, there were attempted break-ins at the clinic manager's house and at 3 other separate nurse accommodation. And there are also break-ins to 2 clinic cars, one a personal car of the midwife and the clinic car as well that evening. Were you aware of that?
I can't recall, but I accept that it was more than likely brought to my attention if that was the state of play at the time.
All right. Were you aware that weapons, including pickaxes and shovels, had been found at one of the properties?
No.
Were you aware that a hole had been smashed into a gyprock roof at one of the properties?
Again, I can't recall. I don't know. I don't think so.
The evidence before Her Honour is that at 3 of the 4 properties that there are attempted break-ins on the night of 8 November, the nurses were home and they were present in their accommodation that evening. Home invasions or attempted break-ins when the person is home, that presents a particular risk to the safety of the person in the home. Do you agree with that?
Agreed, yes.
But why is that, Superintendent?
Well, I guess it's presents a heightened sense of that there'll be an interaction between the offender and the victim. And what I know, based on my experience, is it's unpredictable in terms of what an offender may do when he's observed when they are observed engaged in their conduct. Equally, firstly, similarly for a victim, particularly a vulnerable victim, in terms of what they may or may not do when fronted with an offender within their premises at that point in time.
Thank you. Following the axe incident involving Kumanjayi on 6th of November, you had a discussion with Sergeant Frost that evening, is that correct?
Correct, yes.
And I understand part of that discussion was to confirm the welfare of the members involved in the incident?
Correct, yes.
Sergeant Frost's evidence was that she discussed the need for additional resources with you that evening, and I'll read to you her evidence. I contacted Superintendent Nobbs to let him know of the serious incident and to let him know that I would be seeking resources from town, and this is the reason why. And I obviously told him. I then put on a management significant case note entry with regards to what happened. I also put on an alert on his name as an alert for to be arrested and in case he went back to town. That's at 7:36 in the brief. Do you recall, Superintendent, discussing additional resources that evening with Sergeant Frost?
I think the conversation in terms of additional resources was the following morning, but acknowledge if that's Julie's recollection, then so be it. But my recollection is the following morning, correct.
Her recollection of the Wednesday night discussion was that it involved the IRT in particular.
No.
That's not something that you recall?
No.
All right. The following morning at 8:15 a.m, that's on the 7th of November, Commander Curry sent an email to Assistant Commissioner Wurst, Acting Deputy Commissioner Beer, and to Miss Lauren Weatherall. You weren't a party to this email, Superintendent, but the email reads, FYI, I've spoken to the OIC Sergeant Julie Frost to confirm the welfare of our members. They are a little shaken by the incident. I'm advised the footage is confronting. Superintendent Nobbs will confirm welfare again today of the members and will monitor the situation and consider additional resources, etc., pending community negotiations. That's an email correspondence involving very senior members of Northern Territory Police?
Correct, yes.
Is the reason for the seniority level of those members because of the seriousness of the incident from the night before?
It's not a matter for this witness to comment on why the communications took place or to whom.
Oh, he might know though. I mean, he might know because of practice and procedure.
No.
I'll allow the question, Mr. Hunt.
Thank you, Your Honour.
What I could say as a matter of course, given the nature of the incident that occurred the night before, is that I would have come into work, and I'm not saying categorically here, this is a broad proposition, but I would have brought to Commander Curry's attention the nature of the event the night before, if he wasn't already aware of it. I would have given him some assurance around what my immediate short-term and medium-term response to the matter would have been, and I would have conveyed to him to give him some comfort that I'll continue to monitor the matter going forward, and I would appraise him of any matters of any material benefit throughout the course of my response. And then I presume, given that's my obligation to him, he would have then in turn discharged his obligation by reporting that up as well.
Thank you. Did you discuss with Commander Curry what additional resources may be necessary at that time?
No, not at this stage, because the subsequent conversations with Sergeant Frost then turned towards the plan around the surrender plan, the funeral and the surrender plan.
Had you yourself considered the day after the axe incident what additional resources may be necessary?
I'm not sure if I did or I didn't.
Based on the information you had at the time, the following morning, would you have considered the deployment of the IRT maybe one appropriate response?
Potentially could have been an appropriate response, but the conversations I had with Sergeant Frost throughout that next morning were constructive and optimistic in terms of the likelihood, based on her interactions with Mr. Robinson, that Kumanjayi Walker would surrender. So reducing the need for additional police officers to be deployed.
All right, so the discussion you had with Sergeant Frost the following day was that to the effect that she was optimistic.
We collectively were optimistic. It turned towards the existence of the funeral, the fact that and it was accepted by us that Kumanjayi Walker was predominantly in the community to participate in cultural matters, and it was our position to, notwithstanding the absence of discretion, to put the faith in Mr. Robinson to bring Kumanjayi Walker to the police station pursuant to the surrender plan.
Did you discuss if that optimism turned out to be misplaced, what resources would be necessary?
So we discussed the funeral originally was on the Friday. We had the conversation on the Thursday, and were hopeful, although didn't necessarily expect it to have occurred, given obviously the funeral hadn't occurred at this stage. Then on the Friday we revisited the conversation, and during that time Sergeant Frost indicated that Mr. Walker was still at large. The funeral had been postponed to the Saturday. We were still optimistic, and agreed after backwards and forwards quite robustly that we would honour our commitment to Eddie Robinson. Again, optimistic that after the funeral he would be brought to the police station.
Do you remember discussing what resources would be deployed in particular in the event that Kumanjayi was not brought in by Mr. Robinson?
Again, not at this time, no.
Not at this time.
By my recollection.
All right. On the morning of 9 November, you had another discussion with Sergeant Frost.
Correct, yes.
The evidence to the coroner has been that in addition to the fact that Kumanjayi had not been arrested, she was concerned about the potential for antisocial behaviour after the funeral. Do you recall discussing that with...
Correct. So I guess circumstances changed substantially from the Friday conversation to the Saturday conversation. And that's where I guess we refocused on and recognised the necessity to provide a surge capability out there. Although still optimistic and hopeful around the surrender plan.
Right. And after your discussion with Sergeant Frost on the Saturday morning, you discussed what the capability or additional resources were with Watch Commander Furness in Alice Springs.
Correct, yes.
And specifically, you requested the 4 IRT members, 1 dog handler and a drone operator be deployed.
Correct, yes.
And the dog and dog handler were identified on account of the view that Kumanjayi might seek to run and evade arrest.
Correct, as to provide that utility value, but also the deterrent benefits associated with the dog as being an effective apparatus within a remote Indigenous community.
And as I recall your evidence at your previous appearance, the drone was similarly thought to be useful as an eye in the sky in the event that Coronial attempted to evade arrest.
Correct, although it wasn't available for deployment.
And the IRT members were considered to be appropriate because they could be deployed quickly.
Correct.
And also because you believed that they are highly trained, although we've heard this afternoon there are some limitations to your knowledge about the specifics of that training.
Correct. So every time I've deployed them in the past, I've called their coordinator and I've always had a deployment team identified fairly swiftly. And it's not, I guess, just the availability, but as you've discussed, the perceptions around training and capability, but also the fact that there was a heightened degree of training and it was a cadre workforce that had worked together quite frequently in similar sorts of matters.
Was the training that you had in mind that would be of assistance to the IRT in relation to the arrest of Kumanjayi?
Sorry?
Was the training that you had in mind, their additional training that they had completed, was that specific to the arrest of Kumanjayi?
Potentially.
And were you aware of any other training that they had completed that might be of assistance?
Look, I knew they had close quarters tactics training. It was more about the fact that they were a workforce that can have repeatedly worked together on a number of occasions. And whilst this was a routine matter in my mind, there was a increased level of risk associated with it, given the circumstances that occurred on the... Correct.
Am I correct to say there are also resourcing constraints on your ability to send other general duties police?
Not necessarily. So the IRT are on, day to day, 7 days a week, are general duties police officers. So I engaged Superintendent Vickery and told her that day that as a courtesy that I intended to take four of her police officers that would impact general duties capability. But had I said that they weren't IRT and they were just going to be general duties police officer, I'm sure her response would have been the same. That is, yes, it will have an impact on our front line. However, the greater needs, there's an acknowledgement of the greater needs, and she would have been amenable to the deployment.
All right. After receiving Assistant Commissioner Worth's approval for the deployment, you tasked Acting Sergeant McCormack with providing the administrative order. We've been taken to that administrative order today. This was done by way of an email, subject line, IRT call out, arrest of violent offender, and then Kumanjayi before 3 dot points. And the first of those reads, Kumanjayi is an active target for a breach of suspended sentence, and then provides a number, which in this instance is 9184846. That's a promise number, is it?
Can I No, yeah, sorry, that's a promise number.
And that's provided so that the recipients of this document can find out further information if they wish to do so.
Correct, yes.
And that's the reason for the second number as well in the next dot point.
Correct, yes.
Thank you. Can I ask you then about your telephone call with Helen Gill?
Yes.
That occurred at approximately 2:28 p.m. on the afternoon of 9 November 2019.
I'm not exactly sure of the time, but certainly it was in the afternoon, yes.
That time comes from a note that Miss Gill took.
Okay.
You didn't take any notes at the time of this conversation?
No.
Do you recall during that conversation with Miss Gill that she told you about the break-ins that had occurred over the previous few days?
Yes.
And that consequently staff were not feeling safe in the
Correct, yes.
Do you recall that Miss Gill told you that there were concerns regarding bad ganja innuendo at that time?
I don't recall that, no.
All right.
But it could have. She could have said that.
Do you recall that Miss Gill referred to the funeral that was occurring in innuendo and told you that some of the nurses would remain in the community to allow the release of the body?
No.
Don't recall?
I don't think that occurred, no.
All right. Miss Gill's evidence was that you did not request that the decision to withdraw the staff from innuendo for the weekend be reconsidered, and rather her evidence was that you sounded sympathetic to the difficulties that our staff had been facing in innuendo.
I was sympathetic to the difficulties they've been facing, but certainly I've got a very firm recollection of the conversation, and specifically I said to Ms Gill that this is an unacceptable risk that I don't support, and I said, notwithstanding, I'm happy to work with you and your team on Monday to see how we could reintegrate you back into the community, but it's an unacceptable risk that's not supported by police.
Right. Ms Gill's evidence was that you also told her that police were sending a tactical team as well as a police dog squad to detain a person of interest. Do you recall saying that to Ms Gill?
I said that we were bringing additional police officers out. I probably said they were tactical. I certainly probably said there was a dog also, but it was certainly more about trying to influence her. It was about an appeal to say, we're going to have additional police on tonight. They're going to be providing high visibility patrolling. I can give you, as best I can, some assurances that you'll be safe tonight. And that then was the precursor to, I'm encouraging you to stay. It's unacceptable risks that you go, and that won't be supported.
Thank you. Finally, Superintendent, putting innuendo aside, have you been involved in the deployment of the IRT to another remote community following the withdrawal of the health service?
I don't think so, but I'm not sure. I don't think so, short answer.
Thank you. We'll take the afternoon adjournment.
All stand. I've got my hands up, ready to.
That's an excellent question.
All stand. Coronial Court now stands to please be seated.
Superintendent, I'd like to ask you a handful of questions about the discretion to arrest. Kumanjayi, a warrant to arrest Kumanjayi had been issued by a judge as a result of his breach of suspended sentence. Is that your understanding?
Yes, it is, Your Honour.
In addition, thank you. In addition, of course, he committed a serious assault offence on the Wednesday.
Allegedly, yes.
Is it reasonable to characterise both of those matters as serious?
Yes, Your Honour.
And is your evidence to the court that your understanding is that when an arrest warrant is issued by a judge, it needs to be operationalised with some expedition?
Correct, that is my understanding, yes, Your Honour.
But inevitably, in respect of either of those matters, there is some measure of discretion.
I don't know if there is a measure of discretion.
Not a discretion as to whether to enforce, but a discretion as to when to enforce and how to enforce.
I'm not sure as to whether that's the case. It's I don't know if there is a discretion as to when to enforce. My understanding is that there's no discretion, notwithstanding I exercise the discretion, Your Honour.
Let's work it through together. Upon a police officer, not you, not anyone in particular, receives notice that a judge has issued an arrest warrant, they will have a variety of things to do, and the mere issuing of an arrest warrant does not mean that they have to drop absolutely everything else that they're doing and go and execute it immediately, does it?
Agreed, yes.
All right. So there's obviously some latitude in terms of the timing of enforcement.
On that basis, yes, Your Honour.
And a variety of matters that you have already identified impact upon common everyday exercise as to prioritisation.
Agreed, yes.
And there are other issues of just ordinary humanity and common sense which intrude as well as to when it should be enforced.
Agreed.
And is your position to Her Honour that one of the relevant factors as to the timing of execution of an arrest warrant is taking into account cultural sensitivities such as what appears to be a person's earnest desire to attend the funeral of a loved one?
It certainly was a matter that loomed large for me at the time, Your Honour, yes.
All right, so you make no criticism of Julie Frost or any of those answering to her for extending some latitude as to when Kumanjayi should be arrested after the 6th?
No criticism. In fact, it was I won't say a direction, but certainly an endorsement I provided and I guess an articulation of my expectation, although I don't think I needed to articulate it as an expectation, but yes.
But nonetheless, it was something that was discussed between you and her.
Agreed, yes, Your Honour.
And were you aware that initially on the Wednesday, the communication was given to Eddie and Lottie that they should use their best efforts to encourage Kumanjayi to hand himself in within 2 hours.
I'm not sure if that was my understanding at the time. I accept that that has been evidence provided in this inquest, but I'm not sure if I had a recollection of that at the time.
But again, you would view that as a reasonable communication to those whom Kumanjayi trusted on the same day as his behaviour in relation to the acts.
Certainly, yes. You're on.
And so that should, assuming that the information or that the message got through to him, have communicated that it was the serious wish of the police that he hand himself into custody as soon as he reasonably could.
Clearly our expectation, yes.
Then the next morning, there was a further discussion of which you're aware, is that right?
Yes.
And that was that he hand himself in after the funeral, which at that time was scheduled for the Friday.
Correct, yes.
And again, that being the Thursday and the funeral being on the Friday, do you regard that as a reasonable measure of latitude taking into account cultural sensitivities?
Yes, and that's why I agreed to that.
Right. And then, of course, the funeral was postponed to the Saturday, to your knowledge.
Correct, yes.
And was your expectation that, given that the discussion had been after the funeral, that meant he should hand himself in immediately after the funeral, which was to take place on the Saturday?
That was my clear expectation, yes.
You spoke earlier today to Her Honour about drawing a line in the sand, namely that this couldn't be put off forever, the arrest claimant.
Correct, yes, agreed.
Yeah. And so did you regard the requirement that he hand himself in, for instance, late Saturday after most of the business associated with the funeral was completed as a reasonable one?
Well, inherent in the plan was, I guess, the latitude that had he handed himself any time in before 5 a.m. the following morning, then I guess they were afforded that opportunity by virtue of the plan.
And again, with time to think about it over the intervening years, do you regard that still as a reasonable compromise?
It was, as I indicated before, the competing and balancing risk and the organic risk assessment, in my mind, meant that I had to draw an arbitrary line in the sand as to that I wasn't going to delay it for another day or another 2 days or another week. And I maintain that was a reasonable position in the circumstances.
Did Sergeant Frost or anyone else communicate to you on the Thursday, Friday or Saturday a degree of pessimism about whether Kumanjayi was actually going to cooperate with the latitude that was being extended to him?
I'm not sure.
If you don't recall.
Look, I don't recall definitively. I think the first day we were somewhat optimistic. Whether that waned over the next days, I'm not sure. But again, the funeral was to occur later, so
yes.
Yes.
And there were a variety of sorry business activities associated with the day on which he was to be interred in the ground.
Sorry, can you repeat that question?
There were a variety of other activities at Uendamu associated with the funeral on the Saturday. Is that how you
Correct.
understood?
Yes.
And is that the normal practice, to your knowledge?
Yes.
Of all pre-funerals?
Correct, yes.
And so if he was to hand himself in late on the Saturday or early on the Sunday, was it your expectation that that would afford him the opportunity to have substantial participation in the sorry business associated with the burial in the ground?
Correct, and it would have also afforded the opportunity that we were obliged to do to refer the matter to a magistrate to make an assessment as to whether Kumanjayi Walker continues to participate in the cultural matters.
Yes. I'd like to move now to the arrangements for the attendance by IRT members and the dog handler at Uendamu. At 4:24 on the afternoon of the 9th, there was the communication to which you've referred by Sergeant McCormack to Sergeant Frost. Is that right?
Correct, yes.
And if I were to characterise that to you as the provision of logistical information to Sergeant Frost to enable her to formulate an arrest plan, would that be a fair characterisation?
Yeah, correct. It was to provide the pertinent administrative information to assist Sergeant Frost's development of the plan. So it was a aide memoir for that purpose, I guess.
And you were copied in at the time to that communication from Sergeant McCormack to Sergeant Frost, were you not?
Correct, yes.
Is it fair to assume that you didn't scrutinise it, particularly your interest was more in the actual arrest plan?
Correct, yes.
And at 4:49, Sergeant Frost communicated to you a draft of that arrest plan, did she not?
Yes, correct, Your Honour.
And you then, straight afterwards, had a telephone call with Sergeant Frost.
Correct, yes.
And should Her Honour assume that you discussed the content of that arrest plan with Sergeant Frost?
Correct, yes.
And is it broadly right that you were content with her draft because it attended to the essence of what you wanted in terms of the involvement of the IRT in Uendamu?
Yes, as a macro blueprint, as a broad-based blueprint, yes.
Did you raise anything further with her or ask for any significant amendments to her draft plan?
No. No.
All right. And then Sergeant Frost emailed that plan at 4:59 that same afternoon after the conversation with you. Is that right?
Yes, Your Honour.
All right. And you're quite well familiar with that 4:59 communication, are you not?
Yes.
And you were again copied into it, as was Superintendent Vickery and a variety of other senior personnel, including the territory duty superintendents.
The territory duty officer. We didn't have a territory duty superintendent framework in place at that time.
I'll tell you why I said that to you. Do you have a copy of that in front of you?
Yes, I do.
Plan? Because you'll see that in one of the CCs, there are the territory duty superintendents.
I'm afraid I don't have the subsequent, but I accept it may have been sent to the territory duty superintendent generic email address, but
Yes.
that wasn't attached to a functioning unit at the time, Your Honour.
That's fine, thank you. All right, you've been asked about the purposes of the document, and it's been characterised differently by different people. You've tended to call it a snap order, is that right?
Yes, that's my term.
Is that because it didn't meet the requirements for a formal operations order, which is a more extensive kind of a document?
Correct, yes.
And there's no formal designation of an arrest plan either. But the essence of this was an arrest plan plus other instructions.
Sorry, I'm afraid I don't understand the question.
Let's go through it together. How would you've described a snap order as a short, sharp, decisive plan. Is that right?
Yes.
A broad-based blueprint of what was to happen upon the arrival of the IRT at Uendamu.
Correct, yes.
All right. Having regard even to the heading, namely that which is above the situation, did it have two components essentially to it? To arrest Kumanjayi and transport him back to Alice Springs, first up.
So this is a task.
Do you have a copy of it?
Yes, yes.
Just under good afternoon all.
Yes.
See that? So the first part is to arrest Kumanjayi and transport him back to Alice Springs. See that?
Correct, yes.
That was certainly one of the intentions, was it not?
Yes.
And then just read out to Her Honour the second apparent intention.
Provide a local presence of armed police to uphold the law and order in the community and provide support to local members.
Did that second component represent correctly your intention for the deployment of the IRT members?
In a generalised sense, yes. Could have been articulated better than that, but certainly in a generalised sense. It denotes the respite elements and it denotes community confidence.
Yes. Is this the situation? You were conscious first that the members at Uendamu were fatigued by reason of the various demands to which they'd been subject in preceding days.
Agreed, Your Honour, yes.
And certain of the police officers at Uendamu had been obliged to perform duties elsewhere, including, I think, at Nirrupi.
Agreed, yes.
And there were also some particular issues which had been arising in the days before this. Correct?
Yes.
There'd been a property crime which Mr. Hutton has raised with you in relation to the nurses.
Agreed. Whilst I wasn't aware of how long it had occurred for, I was certainly aware of instances of property crime, yes.
Yes. You were aware that the nurses had left the medical clinic, leaving difficulties in terms of recourse to health services for the community.
Had left or were leaving, and accepted Sergeant Frost's concern that the impacts that would have on police and the expectations. Correct, yes.
Yes, so it had two components. One, it could leave some difficulties for persons to access health services promptly, but it could also have an impact upon the need for police resources to bring or accompany nurses back into Uendamu.
Agreed, Your Honour, yes.
In addition, there had been the need for police at Nirrupi during a carnival and some unrest there in the days before.
Agreed, yes.
And persons were coming back for the funeral from Nirrupi and other places with the potential for that law and order difficulty to spread to Uendamu.
Correct, yes.
Further, in the context of the funeral, it was quite possible that alcohol and ganja might be consumed with some law and order difficulties in Uendamu.
Unfortunately, that is a relatively common occurrence for matters such as a funeral or the like, yes.
And as you've described, Your Honour, you had some concerns in relation to the well-being of Rakesha, given the trio of orders which you've described today that had been taken out, not at her request, but on to provide some safety for her.
Coupled with the actual history of violence and the anecdotal information around the underreporting of violence, yes.
So a variety of issues arising for persons within the Uendamu community, and then there was the need to arrest Kumanjayi.
Yes.
And the arrest of Kumanjayi was not in the context of his being a high-risk offender, but in the context of his having behaved in a threatening way 3 days before, and the fact that he was known to try to avoid arrest by running away.
Correct, yes.
So a combination then of law and order challenges in the community and the need to arrest someone who, while not a high-risk offender, posed some elevated risk if not carefully handled.
That was my contention at the time, yes.
Now, I'd like to identify with you, Superintendent, if I could please, the key elements then of this, let's use your wording, of the SNAP order. Just going through it then, there's some background information provided in it about Kumanjayi and what he'd done and what had happened a few days before, is that right?
Correct, yes.
Then there are some photographs of him to aid in identification of him.
Yes, Your Honour.
There's reference to
the existence of a variety of alerts in respect of him, and that's the part that's in red.
Correct, highlighted in red, yes.
Again, would you say that that's appropriate in terms of providing guidance to the IRT members for how they went about the arrest process?
Correct, it provides guidance, yes.
Now, there's a plan which is divided into 2 days, isn't there?
Yes, correct, Your Honour.
Now, the first one refers to the IRT commencing at 11 o'clock in the evening duty and conducting high visibility patrols and responding to call-outs. You see that?
Yes, I do.
Again, was that meeting your wish that there be an overt presence so as to deal with any difficulties that might be emerging in the community, given the funeral, the break-ins, the influx of people from Nirrupi where there have been some problems in the days before?
Correct, coupled with highly visible, deterrent value, community reassurance benefits, Your Honour.
Right. And likewise, there was the potential, was there not, for there to be call-outs because some difficulties might erupt in the emotional atmosphere of the funeral?
Correct, yes.
And likewise, there was the potential for someone to become unwell and the need for the nurses to be brought back, and they wanted that to occur only in the presence of police.
Yes, I acknowledge there was a contingency plan from Uluru. I didn't agree with the notion that police would escort nurses to all call-outs, but there was some concessions made around that.
Yes. Now, the timing of the commencement of IRT duty is stipulated there as 11 p.m.
Correct, yes.
Sergeant Frost gave evidence at the committal that the issue of their starting time was raised by members of the IRT, and that it was her suggestion that they be able to get some rest and commence duty after having some rest. Again, does that make sense in terms of reasonable allocation of responsibilities to people who'd already had to travel several hours to UNTMA?
Correct, yes.
And she said at the committal, it's going to be a long night for you. Again,
Acknowledged, yes.
That proposition.
Thank you.
She informed the judge at the committal that the members of the IRT said that they were happy to start straight away, and that she acquiesced in that. All right, was that something you knew before today?
I've gleaned it through these proceedings, but not at the relevant time, no.
Now, there are core components to this plan, I'd suggest to you, and then there are parts which are not absolutely central to it. Is that fair?
Yes.
If there was negotiation between Sergeant Frost and the members of the IRT about the timing of their starting duty and conducting high visibility patrols and responding to call-outs, is that the sort of area of a plan that was open to negotiation between Sergeant Frost and the men?
Well, it's always open to negotiation, I guess, insofar as they certainly could have the conversation, but it's a material deviation to the plan, and I would have anticipated that any negotiation and a consensus reached there would have then been communicated to me,
right,
to assess.
All right. Was it within the realm of discretion for Sergeant Frost to authorise the men starting a bit earlier so that she could immediately get some rest, and so that they could start doing what you and she both wanted them to do, namely high visibility patrolling?
Look, we're talking 15 minutes early, probably discretionary, but 4 hours earlier in daylight, no.
You wanted to be informed of that proposal?
That's a material change.
Okay. All right. Now that's all that is identified as their role on day one, and then there is the Sunday, and that involves the dog handler and Constable Alafeo from Uendamu starting duty at 5 a.m. along with the IRT members to effect the arrest of Kumanjayi. See that?
Acknowledge, yes.
Now, is that a core part of the plan, or is that open to negotiation?
That's a core part of the plan.
Okay. Is that a core part of the plan because it is a proposed mechanism of arrest early in the morning to minimise the potential for repetition of the problems that had been experienced on the evening of the Wednesday?
Correct. It's a tried and tested mechanism to conduct an arrest that's similarly circumstanced to this matter.
And did you regard that as fundamental to the minimal use of force and the safety of all involved, including Kumanjayi?
Correct, yes.
And if there was to be any deviation from that, regardless of the 11 o'clock start, would you have expected to be informed of that?
Correct, but for the chance discovery, the
Yes.
scenario I outlined earlier around a traffic apprehension or...
Yes.
Um,
And
correct.
in those circumstances, and Sergeant Frost has described this to Her Honour, if they came across him and it was safe to take him into custody straight away, they should do just that.
Correct, yes.
And then there's a section starting in red as to what they should do if they were able to arrest Kumanjayi.
Yes.
And his being taken back to Alice Springs. Yes?
Yes, correct.
There's also a contingency if there is persistence of fatigue levels. Is that an important part of the plan as well?
Correct, yes.
And this is again referring to the Sunday. And in short, with the next dash point, the plan was for the two remaining IRT members, namely the two who were not conveying him to Alice Springs, to remain in Uendamu and to continue to provide high visibility patrols as well as on-call duties between the hours of 11 in the evening and 7 in the morning.
Correct, yes.
And again, that was part of your plan to try to provide some recovery time for the overstretched members at Uendamu.
Our plan, yes.
Yours and Sergeant Frost's.
Correct, yes.
And there was specific provision should the arrest not work out at around 5 o'clock on the Sunday morning. Namely, that the same plan be implemented the next day.
Correct, yes, Your Honour.
And the arrangements in respect of that were a mirror of what was proposed for the first day.
Correct, yes, Your Honour.
And if there was no arrest at that stage, one can see at the bottom of the Monday 11 November entry in red, there was to be liaison with yourself and Superintendent Vickery as to what to do next.
Yes, correct, Your Honour.
And there were a variety of circumstances in which an arrest on either the Sunday morning or the Monday morning might not prove feasible. For instance, Kumanjayi might have left Uendamu.
Correct, yes.
And there were locations of interest which were identified in the plan.
Yes.
The first of them being the place where he had been arrested before and where the Wednesday incident had taken place and where he normally resided when he was in Uendamu. Is that right?
Yes, Your Honour.
But there was recognition that for one reason or another, he might be at another residence, and those were identified there.
Yes, Your Honour.
Now, so you have been shown the footage during Her Honour's hearing, which shows, in short, that the 4 IRT men and the dog handler left the premises of the police station at about 7:06 in the evening and went straight to house 577.
Yes, I've been shown that, yes.
And did you hear on that when quizzed by one of the community members at house 577, the response of one of the IRT members was, "We're here to grab Kumanjayi"?
Yes, I did hear that.
Now, was there any aspect of the conduct that you have viewed at either House 577 or 511, which would fall within your definition of intelligence gathering?
No, I've provided that evidence in chief that didn't align with my appreciation of what intelligence policing is.
Now, I'd just like to confirm that with you again. You divided intelligence gathering into two forms. The first one was, I think, tactical intelligence gathering. Is that right?
Three forms:
Three.
tactical, operational, and strategic.
Let's just whip through those quickly. Tactical, which is where you try to ascertain the layout, what's close by to the location, and similar logistical information.
Yeah, that's also within operational world. But the distinction between tactical and operation is tactical is here and now. I need to. We've got something that's about to occur now. I need the information, the location. Operational is the distinction.
Let me stop you there. So in terms of tactical information gathering, according to your plan, the arrest was to be taking place some 10 hours later. So
Correct,
is there room for tactical intelligence gathering at 7 in the evening? At
No.
577?
No.
All right. So the next one, you were going to tell Her Honour about operational intelligence gathering,
Correct.
I think?
So that's the operational intelligence. That's a slow burn. Again, it's generally preparatory to an action. In this case, would be the 5:30 a.m. action. It would be, that's where, similarly in terms of the tactical stuff, preparatory to a tactical action, but this would be similar. Configurations of houses, adjacent location, schools, etc., etc., etc. The list is endless.
Yes. Now, in the plan that you've looked at, there's specific reference to the presence of Constable Alafeo, an experienced police member who lived for some time in Uendamu.
Correct, yes.
Now, if I suggest to you that he had two particular roles in potential in this apprehension. The first was to provide intelligence to the IRT members. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, preemptively and at the time, yes.
Right, and next, of course, to assist in the identification of a man who was not otherwise known to the IRT members.
Probably had four functions. The intelligence flow of information. The second one is a definitive in terms of the identity of the individual.
Yes.
The third one would be the negotiation, for the lack of a better term.
Yes.
And the fourth one would have been, for lack of a better term, a friendly face for the families. So there's a respect, and it's not just strangers on the doorstep. So it's a community reassurance piece as well.
Can I add a fifth one? Perhaps the reassurance to Kumanjayi when taken into custody, so that he wasn't too distressed or confused about what was taking place.
Correct. That was an important one, and there was an acknowledgement that Alafeo had a previous history and good relationship with Kumanjayi Walker.
So in terms of the Alafeo component to this plan, how important was it in your structuring and content of the plan?
It's a critical cog in the broader apparatus of the broader framework.
Okay. There was a third component of intelligence gathering to which you've made reference. We've done tactical and operational.
Strategic, that's more around sort of crime data, crime trend analysis, right, to paint a sort of to inform response to sort of emerging threats or issues strategically.
Right. So in terms of what took place at 577 and 511 outside the houses, can we summarise that it was not tactical intelligence gathering, it was preparation to execute an arrest?
Search and apprehend methodologies rather than intelligence gathering methodologies.
Thank you. It was not operational intelligence gathering?
No.
And it was not strategic intelligence gathering either?
No, not by my definition of that, no.
And do you say to Her Honour, on the basis of your 25 years in the Northern Territory Police Force, that that analysis is an orthodox analysis by reference to settled police approaches?
I think so, yes.
Was it important that the IRT members and the dog handler get together with Constable Alafeo prior to undertaking the arrest to coordinate what they were doing and how they would do it?
Correct, that should have occurred the afternoon beforehand, yes.
Alternatively, could it have been done at about 5 o'clock in the morning when they were all summoned to the station before they went out to 577?
Would have been my expectation, and in terms of best process, would have been that the broad framework would have been established the afternoon before.
Yes.
And then the morning would have been a short, sharp discussion where we went situation unchanged and executed the plan then based on the conditions as they were, the prevailing conditions at the time. If situation had changed, well then there might have been some minor tweaking of the plan. But the basis of the plan should have been well and truly established the afternoon before, from my perspective. That doesn't constrain, it doesn't mean it couldn't occur the morning of, but...
Well, there was a key component I suggest to you on the morning, namely that was when Constable Alafeo was commencing duty at 5 a.m. So that was going to be the opportunity for Alafeo to have his input to assist the IRT members.
Correct, but Alafeo was also in the community the Saturday afternoon as well, so by my reckoning he could have or should have participated in those in that dialogue at the time.
But the key issue is that at some point he'd be able to have his input so as to give meaningful guidance to persons who neither knew the arrest target nor the community.
Yeah, agreed, Your Honour, yes.
If it was suggested to Her Honour that the most problematic scenario that could have taken place in the aftermath of what had happened on the Wednesday, the axe incident, was to repeat an attempted apprehension inside a house at a similar time of day, namely around 7 o'clock in the evening, what would you say?
Agreed, Your Honour.
So the attempted entry into 577, where the axe incident had taken place, effectively undermined the plan which you and Sergeant Frost had constructed to maximise the safety of both Kumanjayi, any other members of the household, and police members.
Agreed, Your Honour, yes.
And then when the members made their way to 511, they repeated the error, raising the risks which had taken place just 3 days before.
Correct, Your Honour, yes.
And had you been consulted about that in any way, you would have told the members not to proceed in such a fashion.
Without a doubt in my mind, Your Honour.
And if they had been thinking of proceeding in such a fashion, you would have expected that yourself and Sergeant Frost would have been communicated with so that you would be given your opportunity to have input into the changed plan.
Such a substantial deviation from the plan, yes, I would have expected not only a command but a professional courtesy around that.
Now, the tragedy occurred and you were informed quite shortly afterwards, correct?
Correct, yes.
And immediately you had a variety of concerns about what might be the community reaction.
Yes.
And you told Her Honour today that those concerns were generated from your extensive lived experience in Central Desert communities and your knowledge of Warlpiri people.
Correct, Your Honour, yes.
A variety of other incidents which had occurred quite spontaneously within those communities.
Yes, Your Honour.
And the reality that this was not just an incident between two different families or two different camps, but was an almost unparalleled incident where a police officer had discharged 3 shots into a community member.
Agreed, yes, Your Honour.
You were provided with information from Sergeant Frost in particular about what appeared to be the evolving community response, is that right?
Yes, Your Honour.
Did the information provided to you and the way in which it was provided to you alleviate your concerns in any way?
No.
You've been shown certain videos taken by a community member, which have been shown to Her Honour on the first day of this inquest, which show numbers of people at about 8:30, about 9:30 and about 10:30 that evening. Do you accept that?
Agreed, yes.
And a fair analysis of those does not show any eruption of violent activity, distress or threatening behaviour. Is that fair?
Fair within the construct of those very limited point in time recordings.
Are you making a point by phrasing it that way, that there may have been other things taking place at other times which are not caught on those videos available to Her Honour?
I'm certainly making that that assertion, yes.
And in fact, were you informed that there had been discharged rocks onto the police station?
Multiple, yes.
And then, of course, in due course, you were told about the discharge of rocks at the ambulance and both the person driving it and police officers.
Agreed, yes.
Were you told that it was believed that the health clinic was on fire at one stage?
Yes, agreed.
Did those matters add to the concerns that you had about what might occur if the community learned that Kumanjayi had passed?
Agreed, coupled with my lived experience. As I indicated, there were 2 matters that that changed the dynamics of this situation and inevitably, in my mind, inevitably did not result in a more catastrophic outcome. And they were, as I indicated, the substantial leadership demonstrated by Derek William and the other elders, and the uncomfortable as it sounds, the ruse.
Well, there was also, before the ruse, there was the withholding of information that Kumanjayi had passed away.
Yeah, that's inherent in the ruse
That's
in my
part of
mind.
it, isn't it? And was it in those circumstances that you gave very serious consideration to abandoning the police station for fear of what might ensue if information came to the attention of members of the community that Kumanjayi had passed away?
Well, not only did I give serious consideration, I endorsed the prepared to move order preparatory to an actual evacuation.
Then you spoke to Assistant Commissioner Wurst and you had a robust discussion about the matter, looking at the pros and cons of that course, and you were persuaded by him that it was a better course to remain at the station, provided things didn't get out of hand.
It was persuaded, but it didn't take too much persuading. It was a common sense position, and one that balanced the fact that we still had the capacity to evacuate if certain triggers were reached.
Yes. And again, is this a criticism of the community or any kind of discriminatory attitude toward Warlpiri people?
If it is, it's certainly not my intention that to be the case, and I acknowledge it's probably hard for the Warlpiri community to hear my evidence and my evidence today that's been provided in such fashion, but certainly that's not my intention, no.
Was the situation in your mind that if there was an eruption of violence and an attempt, for instance, to breach the police compound, the situation could be catastrophic?
That's my assessment, yes.
But Assistant Commissioner Wurst pointed out to you that Likewise, abandoning a police station would give a very problematic message, not just to persons in Yuendamu, but right through the Northern Territory, and could have all manner of unforeseen repercussions.
Oh, correct, but he also quite appropriately pointed out that we are the ones there to protect the community. We couldn't lose and leave the police station. We've got service providers in the community. We've got broader community members that are, in the context of a civil unrest matter, would be non-combatants. They need to be protected, and that's the duty we've taken and the oath we've taken, and we couldn't certainly just drive out of the police station.
And so that led to what you have described as a consensus decision to remain, unless, as you put it, triggers changed your perception, in which case you would have communicated again with the Assistant Commissioner about your changed views.
Oh, we may not have communicated. If the triggers were met, then there was a prepared to move and a plan in place to facilitate the immediate evacuation.
But to the commendable restraint of everyone involved and the constructive contribution of Derek Williams and his father, the situation became quite calm after the return of the additional members from the airport.
Correct. Consistent with my contention that there was a broad-based belief that Kumanjayi Walker had been extricated from the community for the purpose of medical attention.
And is it fair to say that you continue to be extremely uncomfortable with the ethical ramifications of what was done, but with all the consideration that you've engaged in over the last 3 years, you stand by your decision and are relieved at what was the outcome?
Agreed, yes.
Nonetheless, it does mean that there was the exercise of deception upon the Walpuri community that night at a very sensitive time.
Agreed, yes.
You would have preferred to have allowed Kumanjayi's close family to be in the station to be with him when he was in his last phases.
I certainly acknowledged the very, very significant cultural protocols and practices around death and sorry business, and yes, it hasn't sat comfortably with me that my determinations and decision making compromised that very important piece for healing.
You were not prepared to put Derek Williams in the terribly difficult position of knowing what had happened and asking you to withhold it from members of his own family in the community.
Yes, and as I indicated selfishly, I needed Derek Williams to continue to do what he was doing, and I couldn't compromise that.
And you regret what cost that has left for Derek and his family, but you stand by the decision, difficult as it was.
Yes.
You accept that utilising health personnel to be in the ambulance was problematic, but it was done again to give plausibility to the appearance of extrication of Kumanjayi for medical care in Alice Springs.
Yeah, I don't know if I'll go that far. In hindsight, it was very poor utilisation of the medical personnel in that regard, and deeply remorseful and sorry to Lorraine for the injuries she sustained and the inevitable trauma that she will carry forever, probably, around it. So
that is something that you would not do upon further consideration.
No, definitely not.
Again. Now, you've been asked a number of questions about the general issue of racism.
yes.
And you've been asked whether the system, however exactly one describes that, acts in one way toward Aboriginal people and in another way toward white people. What would you like to say to the court about your views in that regard?
Well, look, I don't know what to say to that end. It's there was a difficult conversation earlier around a very broad, abstract construct. I don't know. the only thing I could say is repeat what I said, and that is we operate in an imperfect system, and there's always room for improvement. And hopefully this process brings about some meaningful reform, not only for police but for the communities as well. So I don't know if I could go that to the extent that the abstract system seeks to. I'll end it at that.
Yeah. Now, accepting that there is a massively disproportionate incidence of arrest of Indigenous people in the Southern Desert area and elsewhere too.
Agreed, yes.
Do you say that the reason why Indigenous people were arrested is because of their race? Or is it because of their conduct?
Well, again, they're too simplistic, two descriptors that are too simplistic. It's more nuanced than that. It's a multitude of factors that, so I can't answer that question, I'm afraid.
Well, let's try a bit more if you don't mind.
Dr.
Yes, Your
Franklin, I'm just noting the time.
Yes. I've got about 10 or 10 to 15. I mean, you're on a
to
sense. So.
see whether Superintendent Knowles is available to come back.
At your discretion, Your Honour.
I'm sorry that you're in that situation, but it really is not. I really don't have the capacity to sit further, and it's all to do with a lot of other staff that are required to be here to keep the building open and operating. So I think that we will have to ask you to return.
Thank you, Your Honour.
Sorry about that, Your Honour.
No, everyone's trying to do their best to complete these matters, but it's obvious that Superintendent Knowles is a very significant witness and has contributed a lot of information over a number of different areas, and it's important that everybody has an opportunity to extract the information that's important to the inquest, which is what is happening, and appreciate you coming back tomorrow.
Certainly, Your Honour. Thank
Really
you.
gentle.
All stand, and vote on this just.
Yeah, that's around that. Right by Amanda.